Greetings! Today we will look at this new acquisition of mine, the Albion Regent. But first, a word from the sponsor. Fortune favors the bold. This video is sponsored by my personal project, Fortune Favors the Bold, a video game my wife and I co-created. It is a historical game set in mid to late 15th century England and later in other parts of Europe, with a high degree of historical authenticity in terms of story, arms and armor, fighting techniques. The release is due in the next couple of years on PC and next-gen consoles. We have an official website and a Facebook page. If you are interested, please head on there with a link in the description below and give the page a like should you find it interesting or if you like what you see. You will also find this sword in-game as an item, as well as on the project's logo or the coat of arms. It was actually the first sword I commissioned, but it's the latest to arrive. Because of the long waiting period at Albion due to popular demands, the average waiting time for customers exceeds 12 months, and I was lucky enough to get my sword completed in about 11 months. For those of you who are not familiar with the market, Albion is a maker of premium swords, particularly focused on Viking era and medieval European swords, with a few Roman Gladiii and Spasa, with a few fantasy swords as well. Their swords are designed by Swedish legendary swordsmiths, scholar and author Peter Johnsson, who went through the process of measuring actual surviving examples of medieval swords in various museums and private collections. The dimensions, handling dynamics, and the characteristics of the material were carefully examined in order to create accurate reproduction with high level of historicity and authenticity. In addition, Peter Johnsson is one of the original scholars that studied and proposed a theory of harmonic balance in historical swords. These days, he spent most of his time giving lectures around the world, tutoring new generations of swordsmiths at workshops, and occasionally creating sword as fine art.
An important aspect of their shape and design and craftsmanship and decoration is always the hosting culture's cosmology, an idea of heroism and right and wrong, of gods and what is good.
His designs for Albion swords are realized today at a sword-making workshop in Wisconsin, US, with a high degree of precision thanks to the assistance of computer numerically controlled processes. While the grinding of blade geometry, polishing, sharpening, and the crafting of various hilt components are done by hand, and involvement of CNC labs might still make some people consider it's too modern. Although we have to admit that all swords created today we use modern material, in addition, the so-called hand forging process today fully employs modern tools. Personally, while I admire the skills of swordsmiths for forging swords in more traditional means, I'm happy to accept any result of contemporary means in the making of swords, provided it means higher quality. And as such, the level of fit and finish and heat treatment of the blades, the durability, the faithfulness of the handling to the original make a number of people in the historical arms and armor community claiming Albion swords are close to perfection. In this review, we'll examine whether or not this sentiment is based on facts and difference between an Albion and a comparable sword in a lower price range. The sword in question is a Gothic two-handed sword by Darksword Armory. Keep in mind that the purpose of this video is not to put the Darksword Armory on the spot. As in my previous review of this sword, I make it clear that for a mid-range sword, the fit and finish and the handling is more than acceptable. It is a good sword on its own merit. By having this juxtaposition, we can visualize what can or cannot be expected by paying 5 times more at Albion. To start off, both swords are attempts at reproducing one particular specimen of a late 15th century longsword housed currently at Lens Museum at Zurich, Switzerland. The similarity is obvious. but there's also quite a discernible amount of differences. But first, let's have a better understanding of the original piece, dated circa 1450. It is an iconic piece, often featured in the Oakeshott typology as a poster child of the subtype XVIIIb, which is a family of swords popular in Germanic region at the time. It is characterized by its long and slender blade, usually runs between 37 and 40 inches, with a gentle profile taper until the last quarter of the blade, where the profile taper becomes increasingly aggressive to an acute point. The blade has a flat or hollow ground diamond section that enables very clean cuts, yet with subprominent central ridge, they increase the rigidity of the blade that's able to deliver increasingly stiff thrust, as well as making it more forgiving in cutting when the edge alignment is suboptimal. For the place in history the subtype XVIIIb swords have, we'll first examine the term longsword, which is often misinterpreted and misused. The modern term longsword is distinguished from a longsword. Some might think a sword like this 12th century Holy Roman Empire coronation sword is a longsword because it features a 37-inch blade, almost as long as this 15th century two-handed sword. But it is instead a single-handed sword given the length of its grip. Indeed, the Type 11 family of swords generally served as the cavalry sword at the time. The short grip ensures single-handed usage that will deliver powerful long-range cuts from horseback. The modern term longsword comes from the German term Landschwert, which used to denote the type of grip instead of the type of swords. Holding onto swords with two hands on the grip is considered Landschwert, while the holding the sword with one hand on the grip, the other one on the blade is considered half swording. In contrast, however, you can see this grip demands a length of grip for two hands. The techniques developed around longswords, which are showcased extensively in a great number of sources written by late 14th century and 15th century fencing meisters or maestros, some of the most complex systems among all the armaments around the world at the time. Techniques taught in these treatises, particularly in the Germanic traditions, such as Johannes Lichtenau, Sixmund Ringek, Hans Tauhofer, and later Paulus Hectormeyer, but heavily focused on binding and winding that pretty much requires longer grip and generous space between two hands for you to pull off this kind of technique. The two-handed grip also optimizes leverage to assist in the binding and winding, almost like a chess game between two combatants. This requires a generous space in between two hands, so two hands wouldn't collide when you twist the arm, forearms, and wrists. Italian tradition taught by treatises written by Fiore de Liberi and Filippo Vadi also put heavy emphasis on leveraging the blade to assist in grappling and takedown. So you see, a longsword is usually a sword with reasonably long blade, but more importantly, a long grip. Interestingly, the world's earliest longswords, found so far by archaeologists, were not implemented in Europe, but by swordsmiths in China more than 2,000 years ago. This is a reproduction by L.K. Chen, a sword excavated from a tomb dated 3rd century BC. You can see a lot of parallels between this 2,300 years old design and the 15th century European longsword, namely the long and slender blade profile, the edge geometry. This one also features a hollow ground blade, yet it's more of a octagonal cross-section rather than a hollow ground diamond section on this Oakeshott XVIIIb sword. They have a similar degree of distal taper and flexibility, and yes, very long grips. Unfortunately, Even though there's a rich source of latter century Chinese sword treatises, there's no record back 2,300 years ago on how to use these massive swords, other than some more philosophical writing in the line of you should thrust to pierce and you should cut to sever. So it's kind of an endorsement of more committed strikes with power and conviction. However, based on the lightweight and lively handling characteristic of this Chinese longsword, you can also see it's extremely agile and technical weapon, similar to the European longswords. In Europe, two-handed swords first emerged in the late 13th century, categorized by sword scholar George Oakeshott as type 12A and 1213A swords. Both were called great swords of war at the time. The development of plate armor, which started to cover limbs as well as the torso and head, is credited of contributing to the decline of shields and enabling the usage of weapons that required both hands. These swords feature a long grip, of course, and the blade length runs between 35 and 37 inches, with a lenticular blade cross-section, a fuller that reduces the blade weight. Their blade doesn't taper much in terms of profile, with the type 12A only has a slight hint of profile taper, and type 13A almost doesn't have any taper in the profile at all until the very last few inches toward tip. And the tip is usually spatulated instead of terminating to a point on the 13A type. They are almost entirely concentric swords, designed to maximize the damage, even across tough textile armors like gambesons worn by common soldiers on the battlefield. Even though they were seen as great swords compared to the common one-handed arming sword used universally as sidearm at the time, they are not extremely heavy, usually weighing between 3 and 4 pounds. However, no evidence of complex usage had been developed at the time for these great swords. Fast forward to a century later, there was a boom in written sources, primarily reserved for nobility and the knightly class, to document various techniques associated with swords in two hands. But then almost every treatise illustrated a longsword with a vastly different blade type, known as the Oakeshott type 15A today, characterized by a linear tapered blade to a very pointy tip. The profile of the blade is almost triangular, with a thick diamond cross-section that make the blade incredibly rigid. Indeed, with many of the maneuvers shown in the treatises to be a primarily anti-armor weapon, longswords seem to have evolved from entirely cut-centric to thrust-centric. Although in civilian dueling and self-defense situations of armor, the Type 18A sword can still pack some rather acceptable cuts, given it's a long blade to deliver great tip speed. The blade is designed to thrust through male rings, busted open, while penetrating the protective garments underneath, such as the army doublet and the padded jacket. Armor at this stage had developed into foot plate harnesses. So two-handed armaments become more common. It needed to deal with more opponents clad in foot plate armor as well. So finding the gap of these articulated plates and bypassing the layered defense underneath seemed to be the primary goal. In the next several decades, longswords have yet to evolve again, and the pendulum swung backward from the thrust end of the spectrum to be balanced between cut and thrust. Perhaps due to the advancement of metallurgical technology, the Type 16A and Type 17 offer similar solutions. Type 16A longswords experimented with progressive profile tapers, much like this Type 18 sword family, but with a fuller lenticular or hexagonal cross-section. And type 17 sports a very slender blade with hexagonal cross-section to make cuts cleaner while maintaining a certain degree of rigidity. Yet, it was the type 18 family of swords dominating the popularity across different regions of Europe. It has 6 subtypes that all share the characteristics of similar profile tapering strategy and the diamond cross-section, often with hollow round. And a very beefy central ridge. Various subtypes are popular in Italian states, Germanic kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as England, France, Denmark, Spain. Many of them serve as the nobilities and monarchs' personal swords, preserved until today. But even their techniques are exclusively for high-status audiences, typically written by maesters or maestros for their students. Say a duke's son, whom they were employed to train or tutor. With this context in mind, let's take a look at the general dimensions and the proportions of the Albion Regent and its competitor here. Both swords fall into the parameter of the Oakeshott Type 18 swords. The Regent features 37.25 inch blade and a 10.25 long grip, including the pommel, while the Gothic two-handed swords features a 39 inch blade and 10.5 grip. The crossguard is where the two swords deviate the most from each other. The Regent has a 9.6 inch guard, and the Gothic Longsword guard is measured at 8 inches. Accuracy-wise, I'm going to give it to the Albion Regent here. Functionally speaking, the crossguard needs to provide more coverage to both the hand and the forearms. This is particularly important for longswords over one-handed swords during techniques involving binding and winding. The lack of shield or bucklers in the offhand demands this. So the Regent's crossguard lens is more scientific and more faithful to the original, which isn't surprising given how careful Peter Johnsson measures and examines the antique pieces when given the access to it, and incorporated the dimension into the design. You can see the blueprint of the sword at Albion here. The Darksword Armory's Gothic Longsword features a crossguard lens that's plausible to the period, as a small number of users preferred shorter crossguards, so they're less likely to interfere with their techniques. On the other hand, the Gothic Longsword's blade lens is more faithful than the Regent to the original. However, personally, I still prefer the Regent's blade lens due to my personal physiques. I stand at 6'1" or 186 centimeters. The portion of the Regent is just right for me. The 37-inch long blade provides protection and coverage for me, for someone of my stature. The width of the crossguard provides ample protection to the hand and forearms. You do all these bind and wind techniques, but it's not overly lengthy, so your tip is less likely to dip to the ground and damage the tip. Both swords have the grip length about just right for me, with space between the two hands generous enough, but not excessive, as when the grip gets too long, it's harder to use the leverage to your advantage, because a cut that incorporates rotation from the wrist of the main hand will demand more movement of the offhand. As showcased here in cutting with the Chinese Miao Dao with a 50-inch long grip. Look how much my left hand had to move and the degree of elbow had to bend. And in this regard, you can see that the Regent has a grip with a lens that's very generous. However, you decide to hold the grip, whether with your hands holding together or with a space in between, these are both possible and very comfortable. Some will prefer this grip, as if you do any winding, your offhand will not travel a long distance, such as this. You can probably guess that an overlong grip will make your offhand travel a long distance as you do any winding or do any wrist cutting. Of course, you're maximum your leverage that way. However, that's just not what everybody prefers. Some will try to hold it this way. Personally, I prefer holding it this way, so your main hand and offhand wouldn't clash and interfere with each other. With a blade of this size, 37-inch, it's quite light, very maneuverable. You'd be surprised how good the point control is. Not difficult at all to get a point where you want it to be. You know, all the gaps in the plate armor. Still, the balance of this sword pretty much guarantee that your cuts will be very authoritative. It's still very easy to control, very easy to stop at any given point. Best compromise between the point control and assorting cuts. So I'm extremely happy with this design. It's an excellent implementation of the Type 18B longswords. One thing I appreciate about the design of the Regent is the proportion of its grip and the weight distribution, the handling characteristics, lends itself to be a good true hand and half sword. Why do I say this? Well, longswords in medieval times has fulfilled two purposes. One is a two-handed primary weapon. The other one is a single-handed sidearm. While there are situations you have to use it as a one-handed weapon. Say you're on the battlefield, you decide to pick up the shield to stop missile fire, and you still need this sword to function with one hand. Or if you're on the horseback, you need to deliver blows from the top of the horse, and this has to function as a one-handed weapon while the other hand is holding the rein. Also, if you look at many of the fighting techniques prescribed by Fury Delivery in these manuscripts, there are situations you have to let go of your offhand. Say after a parry, and you stop the opponent's blow, and you enter a bind, and you quickly come around with the offhand to do an arm lock, to control your opponent's arm or wrist, and presumably their blade, and you have a very short window of opportunity to use that at close range with your longsword as a one-handed weapon. Or if you trick them to make them lose the balance, calm down with your sword, do a one-handed incapacitating blow. The weight distribution of this sword makes sure that it's balanced in a way that in one hand is very manageable. Even though, given its heft, it's probably not preferable to fight this way. In many situations, you can easily use this in one hand and fulfill the purpose. Moving on to the comparison of the fit and finish. Let's start with the pommel. It is obvious that the Albion Regent has way more dimensions implemented with this relatively complex pommel type. Especially when you inspect laterally, the central crevice is very well done. The shape is almost completely symmetric. Although it will never be perfect as it's ground by hand, but you can see how much more flawed the Darksword Armory's pommel is in comparison. Some minor flaws are present on the Albion Regent, namely a tiny ding here, some visible bluing of the steel. I wonder whether it happened during the hot peening process as the steel was heated up. Speaking of the peen, Albion almost always sand down the peen to blend in with the pommel. On this sword is no exception, and it's difficult to even make out where the peen is. This is especially commendable on a pommel with such complex geometry. Kudos to Albion. Dark Armory Longsword, however, has a peen you can make out. Well, it's not really rough, and it doesn't have a lot of hammer marks. There is some visible blackened substance next to the peen, detracting the aesthetics of the sword slightly. Some very minor dings and scratches are also present on this sword as well. Onto the grip. This is where I think the Albion really shine in general, even compared to many other premium sword makers. The grip of the Albion Regent is extremely well done, with this top portion as a hexagonal ox blood leather wrap over wooden core with 2 risers, and it's totally flush with the crossguard. The lower portion of the grip is wrapped with twisted steel wire, secured in place with rivets. It looks excellent. The termination of the leather wrapping is also very flush with the pommel. When you grip onto the sword, it provides ample space for hand-and-half usage, so there's no interference at all for any of these wrist and forearm twisting movement. This half steel wire wrap itself costs $250. The thickness of the hexagonal grip is just right. The leather provides enough traction for the hand. The steel wire wrapping is very even, and when you hold on to it, it's not overly aggressive, and it's very period correct. The crossguard, if you can see, has a very small gap between the guard and the blade. This is extremely well done. One of the smallest gaps I have ever seen in any production source, and is also what Albion is known for. The crossguard incorporates Peter Johnsson's love of geometries and dimensions. It's octagonal shape crossguard, and it has a central ridge that's crisp but still very comfortable. When you do the thumb grip, it has these cutout on the crossguard and the near the extremities to provide an air of sophistication. We'll scope down the blade under the sun to gain an appreciation of the blade. The hollow ground is extremely well done on the blade. The central ridge is arrow straight for the first 2/3 of the blade, but I gotta admit there is some irregularity down the line, which is almost unavoidable because these are all hand ground. The polishing is high satin finish, looks excellent. Near the tip of the blade, I don't know whether you can see that, there is some very minor asymmetry on the 2 sides of the blade. This is very difficult to grind because of the very unique tapering strategy. You see this on many of the blade, even on the premium price range. But overall, an extraordinary blade that balanced very well. Let's look at the rigidity of the blade. There is some flex, but overall it's very rigid for good thrusting. Very solid and reliable thrusting that can penetrate mail armor. And when we look at the tip, it's also reinforced to be able to penetrate flat mail rings. You can have a better overview of the blade portion. The profile is very accurate to historical sword blades of the XVIIIb type. At the base is 2 inches or 5 centimeters wide, and the tapering progressively increases as it reaches the tip, so a bigger portion of the blade remains relatively broad. There is also a significant amount of distal tapering, from 8.6 millimeters at the base to 3.2 millimeters at 2 inches from the tip. Well, if you wonder what a hologram blade is, consider this extreme example of Zolian straight razor. If you look at the geometry here of the blade, you see is concave ground, and to provide this very thin cutting edge while still having this robust spine. So obviously this is an extreme example of hollow ground. The sword hollow ground will never be as thin as this to ensure the durability. Cutting from a tricky angle while having a subpar edge alignment will sometimes cause edge damage. The edge will deform or chip. Now let's analyze Darksword Armory's Gothic Longsword in similar lighting conditions. I hope you can see that the hollow ground isn't as prominent as it is on the Albion Regent. There is also a perceivable amount of small ripples along the blade. The blade has a very noticeable secondary bevel. This is very common for blades in budget or medium price range, that they don't polish and sharpen the sword as one process, but rather have someone else to sharpen it on a belt sander after the customer ordered it sharp. So the edge geometry is definitely not as good as it could have been. The central ridge is basically straight, but I can make out some inconsistencies down the line. The profile tapering on the blade is mostly done symmetrically. Once again, the attention to details on the design and execution of the sword offers a glimpse of Peter Johnsson's obsession with geometries, dimensions, and proportions aided in the creation of the sword. You can just see here the octagonal shaped crossguard swells towards the end of each extremity. Each surface and its edges are sanded down to be rounded to avoid discomfort. The lines are still very crisp compared to this Darksword Armory's sword. You can see here it's roughly an octagonal shape as well. They're just not as well defined. This one also has all the edges rounded, so it's relatively comfortable to hold on to. But here's the thing, I think make the big difference. On the center portion of the crossguard is flush with a grip. Also, there's no transitional ledges, so all the sub grip is easily done. There's no jarring parts for this Darksword Armory sword. I hope you can see that on the crossguard. There's this very odd triangular shape. It's a diamond in totality. It pops out of the grip's dimension. So it's very difficult to do a sub grip on this sword. If you look at the gap between the crossguard and the blade, this is one of the smallest gap ever. Obviously, this is very laborious to execute. You have to grind the blade to perfectly fit the opening of the crossguard. It fits this hollow ground diamond cross-section perfectly well. The Darksword Armory sword, however, has a very large gap here, a rectangular slot instead of custom fit to this hollow ground blade. I think this perfectly illustrates the amount of attention to details or the quality of fit and finish between a premium level sword and a sword of medium price range. I think it's pretty obvious that the fit and finish on the Albion sword is much more refined than Darksword Armory sword, which is not surprising at all consider the price difference. Last thing I want to touch upon the scabbard of this Gothic Longsword. It's very generous for Darksword Armory to include this scabbard in their price. As you may know, that custom scabbard for Albion swords usually costs as much as the sword itself. Here you can see some exquisitely made scabbards by Brian Kuhns and Christian Fletcher. Keep in mind that these scabbards cost several $1,000s and take years to finish after commission. For my Albion Regent, I commissioned a scabbard from Todd's workshop of England, and we settled down for this specific design that cost 1,300 British pounds as an initial estimate, which amounts to $1,760, incidentally doubling the cost of the Regent, and pushes the overall price of the package to $3,600. This scabbard is perfectly utilitarian. It offers 2 risers on scabbard, which is kind of odd, as they usually fit either the fullers or the central ridge of the blade. When you sheath the sword with the scabbard, it doesn't rattle, it doesn't fall out, it's very snug. It's not hard to draw the sword at all. At last, we come down to my verdict. I think the Albion Regent with the half steel wire wrap version at $1,760 worth every penny. Given its attention to details,
its price is reflected. The quality of its fit and finish, how it handles, faithfulness to the historical original. However, lengthy waiting period may be a bigger deterrent. All in all, it's worth every penny. It earned my seal of recommendation.
That's not to say the Gothic sword from Darksword Armory isn't the worst sword. It's perfectly fine as it is. If you want a reproduction of this type of sword with some refinement and sophistication without breaking your bank, this is a worthy choice. I hope you find my review of this style of juxtaposition interesting, and it can offer some values to sword collectors and consumers. If so, please leave a like to this video and subscribe.